Monday, July 11th, 2014, and you're listening to SYN Boldly, the podcast, the Sign Your Name Project. I'm your host, Trey Comstock. With me this week is the full team again. We have the hand-jiving Kathleen Royston.
It was a llama.
Hand-lomming Kathleen Royston. And the ever-faithful Stephen Doss.
I'm here once again.
On this week's episode, we are as ever dealing in serious topics. And this week, it's a particularly serious topic in the way people approach, theologically, depression, and in particular within that, suicide. So there's kind of a news element, but this is really a purely discussion show. So I intro this with a news story. As many of y'all probably know by now, certainly if you're listening to this, what will be sometime Tuesday morning when this will go up, Oscar-winning actor Robin Williams died on Monday of an apparent suicide, and the kind of messaging out of his publicist is that he had been battling severe depression lately, and he was law enforcement's reporting that he was dead in his Northern California home at the age of 63. And so anytime someone takes their own life, I think there's people wonder why and wonder how these kind of things happen and wonder, what's going on in that person's mind. But they also, I think there's a need to think about it theologically. And there are a lot of theologies that get thrown around, particularly around suicide. In some denominations, it's considered a sin that kind of excludes you from the love of God or excludes you from heaven, or is somehow a more mortal sin than in other places. And other denominations and other theologians take other views on it. And then there's also the question of kind of what could we have done, what could we as a community do to prevent suicide or to reach people who are on the verge of suicide. And so there's a lot of theological questions that come up, not just around about the death of this one man, although it is very tragic. And I've enjoyed many Robin Williams movies in my life, particularly Mrs. Doubtfire, but that's maybe a personal problem. So it's more about me than anything else. So what are y'all's kind of, on the broad view, and then we'll kind of drill down as we ever do, what's your perspective on kind of how the church or how churches approach suicide?
Well, first of all, Mrs. Doubtfire is a great movie.
It is a great movie, isn't it?
It's a great movie. I personally like Aladdin, the first one.
Yeah, okay, another great Robin. Not one I always think of as a Robin Williams movie, but I absolutely love the character.
Oh,
of the
he
genie.
owned that movie. It's not an Aladdin movie.
Certainly the best part of that movie.
Yes,
I absolutely agree.
But back at the task at hand.
You mean we're not just eulogizing Robin Williams? Because I could do that for hours.
Oh yeah. First movie I ever remember seeing in theaters was Toys.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Anywho, back to what we were talking about. I don't know how... I grew up in a denomination that, yes, stated that, anytime you willingly took your life, you were basically giving up on what God gave you. And that was to use your terms, a mortal sin.
Yeah.
It was something that did separate you from the love of God because you were willingly separating yourself. It wasn't anything that God did. It was you doing it willingly, and that's what caused that separation.
Sure.
At least that's how it was explained to me.
Yeah.
If we have any other, not United Church of Christers, but Church of Christers that are listening to this show, and you have heard it another way, send us feedback. Let us know. We want to make sure that we get all things on this show. Because, fact checking is, as you say, Trey,
the death of all podcasting.
But as I've grown, I've realized that, the church tries its best to help. And at its best, it's a place where you can come with your issues, your baggage, your stuff.
When we're doing it right, absolutely.
When you're doing it right. However, a lot of times people feel like the church is a place where you can't be genuine, which is sad, because it should be the place you should feel the most genuine.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting you bring it up, because that certainly is something I resonate with. I was a certain troubled youth, I guess. I suffer from depression. And growing up, for me, it was a lot worse than, I'm a lot better at managing it now, but it certainly spilled over for me into thoughts and attempts of suicide when I was 16, 17. And for me, one of the big driving factors is I felt completely alone in it for a very long time, despite the fact that I was part of a youth group and part of a church family. And I love my church family, and I'm about to be going back and visiting in a couple weeks. But I felt like church wasn't a place where that church wasn't a place for me, because I didn't fit into that kind of happy, put a brave face on and everything's always okay kind of thing. And that way of doing church, or that maybe it isn't really how we were doing church, but my perception of what church was supposed to be was a bunch of happy people always just, oh, Jesus has just so blessed me today. I'm like, I don't feel that. Probably objectively I am blessed, but when I'm suffering from a mental illness, suffering from depression, I don't necessarily see that. Despite the fact that it's probably very real, and there are many aspects of my upbringing that have been very blessed. But when the weight of depression is on you, you don't necessarily see that. And so I didn't I was at church, but it wasn't the leaders in my church or the adults in my church that really helped me, because I didn't see that as a place for me. For me, it was the other kids in my youth group who were going through similar things, or had gone through things, or having their own problems, and we kind of formed our own family within that. And that's eventually what was able to bring me out of it. It wasn't really the church. It was, to me, people living actually real lives, and that's not what the church looked like to me.
I also think that a lot of the conversation around mental illness still makes it seem like it's a personal choice.
Yeah.
Like, that there's
I've done that my whole life.
Right, like you're like,
why are you acting like that?
You have personal responsibility for this, and like you just need to snap out of it.
Like I get that all the time. I literally have been getting those exact words my whole life. Why are you I always get I still do, even as an adult. Why are you acting like that? It's like, there's a lot of words I could say to that.
Screwy. That's the other thing, is like this sort of, no one would ever ask a cancer patient, like,
why do you have cancer?
Why can't you just get over your cancer?
Mental illness, Mitch Hedberg has a great line about this. Mental illness is, you wouldn't go up and say, why do you have lupus? Like, you wouldn't do that,
Jim,
right?
Why do you have lupus?
Jim, why do you have lupus? Mitch Hedberg is particularly talking about another soul that was taken from us far too soon. But he's actually talking about alcoholism, but it's another kind of mental illness. Like, why are you an alcoholic? Jim, why you have lupus? Like, it's not, like, you wouldn't do that. We don't. We think of mental illness as somehow a special category of illness that is actually the sufferer's fault.
Right. And I think,
well, mental just means it's all in your head.
It is, yes, but your head is an organ just like your stomach.
And we were watching CNN earlier, and I frequently find myself wanting to punch Larry King in the face in All Christian Love, and this was one of those moments.
But he would turn to dust.
When
he would.
When he was saying something like, I just don't understand how someone who was this famous and had all of this, all these material resources, like, why would this happen? And I'm like, well... So I think that's the other thing, is looking at, and I think that happens in the church too, is people look at external life situations, it's like, oh, well, you have a family and a wife and a good job, like, what's wrong? Like, why can't you just get over it? And
because I have a malfunctioning endorphin receptor, like,
right, take it up with the brain.
Take it up with the brain.
And so I think that anything that pastors and people in church leadership can do to really bring the fact that mental illness is an illness to the forefront can be very, very helpful.
Yeah.
And I think acknowledging it, acknowledging it from the
Calling
pulpit.
it illness.
Like,
Right. I mean,
instead of,
I actually,
what's so down, Charlie Brown?
I
Stuff like that.
specifically pray, every week we do prayers of the people. I specifically pray for those experiencing mental illness every week. And I've had folks in my congregation who have lost folks to suicide, or who I know are suffering from depression or whatever, bring that up. Like, you do that every week. And it's like, yeah, I want to make sure that we name that. And that as a church, I preach probably more frequently than I need to about, suffering in the Bible, and how, suffering, and, read the Psalms, and you see a lot of, Walter Brueggemann has this great thing about read the Psalms, you see people really mad at God. That this Christian life isn't always easy, and it doesn't always result in us being those happy, smiley people. It's why I write all of my own Christian dramas, because I've seldom find a Christian drama that it doesn't look like Seventh Heaven or whatever the hell that show was, where it was always came together so neatly, even though they had all of these terrible problems.
If they just prayed, everything
they just prayed, and then the pastor who was the dad came in and saved it. So they're not from Minnesota, but apparently that's the voice I got. And so, I mean, I really try. That is something I really try to do in my ministry, is not be that kind of pastor and not lead that kind of church, because that almost drove me out of the church, and it really caused some deep struggles in my own life.
I don't know if I've told this story on air, but when I was in my mid-20s, I was going through a crazy difficult time. Just heartbroken. And have I told this story? Okay. If I have, sorry, I'm repeating myself. It's okay. And I still went to church, because that's just
Sure, it's just
I
what
did.
you do.
It wasn't I need church today. It was like, you just get up and go to church. And I remember sitting there in the pew, feeling like, this is going to sound really cliche, but literally my heart was breaking. I was in so much pain. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if everybody else in the room was in the same kind of pain that I was. If there were other adults who it had cost them so much to get out of bed that morning and put on a brave face and wash their hair, and they were still there anyway. And I wondered about all of those burdens that people carry around that they never talk about. And it was this moment where I was like, oh my gosh, so many people in this room are going through the same thing. How come we never talk about it?
Right.
And there's something about anyone who has been through crap, and if you reach out to someone else to talk about it, it's amazing how people you never expect have been through great ordeals. And how our suffering can in some ways tune us into the suffering of other people, which I think is for me, I see that as God working through our pain.
I mean, it has certainly, I don't always think about it this way, but it does, when these situations come up in pastoral care settings, I take a different approach to it than I would had I not had these experiences.
Right. But I think that in church leadership, it can be very, very important to acknowledge that in a very public way. And I definitely think the prayers of the people are a wonderful way to do that. I think sermons are a good way to do that, is to kind of, as much as possible, acknowledge in a public way that when you sign up to follow Christ, you're not signing up for ditching all the junk that goes along with being a human being.
Right. And that church isn't a place where we all have to look like God has just blessed us all the time. I mean, it is a place to recognize that, when it happens and when you're feeling that, but we're not always going to feel that way. And it's not unfaithful to talk about the other side of the coin.
And I think at its best, a community of faith carries those burdens with you, so you're not entirely alone. I think that's the other piece of it. But nobody can carry our burdens with us if we pretend that they don't exist. And I think we spend so much time in this culture pretending that everything is okay.
Well, and I think people who, in my experience, in knowing other people who have had similar experiences to me, you become just a really good actor. Because the world, you get the sense that no one wants to hear about it. And so you get to the point where you can just act perfectly okay, right? Like, had life-altering experiences the night before, show up to school with my homework done, right? And as long as I got to school with my homework done, no one cared. No one noticed. I was the actor in the theater department, like, no one cared. Or I could make it so that no one would notice. Probably, I didn't think people cared. Probably in reality, people did. But you get really good at covering it up. And that's dangerous because that's also still isolated. That part of what the psychology of this is you start to think you're the only person that feels this way and no one understands it. And while no one, and I'll say this, no one truly understands exactly what you're going through. And no one ever hears, no, I know what you're going through. No, you don't. Even if you do, no, you don't.
Right.
Yeah.
But there are people that care, and there are people who are willing to listen, and theoretically, your pastor should be one of those people. Now, in big churches, that gets complicated because maybe you don't know your pastor all that well. But there are people, church should be the place. And if we are doing church right, church is the place where you know those people are. The people that are willing to wade through the mess of life with you, if we're doing this right.
There was a really fabulous article in the New York Times a few weeks ago about how part of the reason that we stay so busy is there's this huge cultural push to avoid negative emotions.
Sure. Yeah.
And like they linked to this really fabulous clip of Louis C.K. maybe on like Conan or something, where he talked about why he wouldn't buy cell phones for his kids. And he talks about like that's why we're like driving and texting, because like you're in your car and all of a sudden you start to feel the sadness. And the only way to like make the sadness go away is to text. And he was like, we want to avoid the sadness so much that we are willing to put our lives in our own hands to avoid the sadness. And he like told this story about how one day he like felt it and he was like, fine, I'm just going to embrace the sadness. And so he was like, I had to pull over the car and cry. And he was like, but here's the thing, after like in that, opening myself up to that sadness also opened myself up to other feelings.
Right.
And I think that sort of, anyway, it's a really, really great clip, but it's a powerful thing that we spend so much of our time running from negative emotions. And I think the church is like, how many sad songs are in the hymnal? Like
right, a lot
2, and it's all for Jesus dies
right.
on Good Friday.
Yeah.
I was looking at the Evangelical Lutheran Worship, which is the hymnal of the ELCA. They have an entire section on lament.
Interesting.
I was like, this is fantastic.
That's because they're German.
And
they're Germans like their lament. I mean, you got to admit that.
Well, and they had this really great Marty Hagen song to the tune of "O Sacred Head Now Wounded" about God, why are you silent? And it was fabulous.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, like, what might it be like to actually sing that in a congregation?
Yeah.
Like, no, you're going to kind of, the people who are having a great, this is the day the Lord has made kind of morning are going to think it's kind of a downer, but there are people there who that is exactly what they need to hear.
But I think, Lamentations came up last year in the lectionary cycle, and it only comes up once every 3 years.
I know, it's like
and it's one passage from
target's
Lamentations,
like that big.
and that's it. Like, it's
That's
nothing.
fun.
And my opener for my sermon was, I read the main text I was going to preach on, and then I read that in a whole passage of Lamentations. And talked about how, like, there's a whole book called Lamentations, and you have a right to be sad.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And this is a place for that. And it was interesting, the response, because I think everyone in that congregation can identify it in some way. And as pastors, like, we hear the junk, right? Like, we hear about it. And I'm in a small enough congregation that I kind of know, through all the various, pastoral care that I've had a chance to do, that, like, I kind of know what's going on in a good percentage of the lives of my people in my congregation. And you kind of see how that spoke to different people in different ways. But everyone, I am convinced, I have not found a single person, living, real person, that doesn't have some sense of lament in their lives. Whether it's something that happened to them as a child, the loss, that death is a reality in every family, whether it's grandparents or great-grandparents, at some point we all lose someone who's close to us. And that I found is a great source of pain, or it's sickness or whatever. But everyone in that church, everyone in that in the congregation, that you looked out on, everyone had some reason for lament. Was it percentage-wise different? The human brain's an interesting thing. There's only so much emotion the human brain can process, and once you hit that 100%, it doesn't matter how much further you go down the really bad things happening to you path. We all kind of know what that emotional cap is. You only have 100%, and it doesn't just keep going because it's a chemical receptor. It's fascinating brain chemistry, really it is. But that's what's interesting about empathy is you really do know what that feels like. Mm-hmm. We all do, because we all know what our emotional 100% feels like. Mm-hmm. Whether it's whatever the circumstances it was brought on by. When you're a kid, that 100% may be brought on by the death of that frog you had for a week. And that's, I don't want to downplay that, because that can be really traumatic when you're 5. And for me, what happened to me brought kind of me to my emotional 100%. And so I know what that feels like. And it's awful.
And I think that when we spend so much time squelching that, I don't know, and especially I think it's the thing about traumatic life events is they force you to sit with your sadness. Sure. Because you don't really have a choice, right? Like you don't. My favorite, this is weird, but my favorite book for this is Going on a Bear Hunt. Which is a kid's book about you can't go over it, you can't go under it.
You gotta go through it.
Oh no, yes, we gotta go through it. And I think that traumatic life events force you to sit with that. I think that what can be hard is not having gone through those traumatic life events. You can outrun the sadness of being human for a fair amount of time. And so I think that in worship and I think in preaching, we have an opportunity to kind of neutralize that, to destigmatize how hard it is to be a human being.
Yep. I kind of, in thinking about that clergy angle, my mother was telling me about a funeral she went to this weekend for a man who committed suicide. And his was definitely one of those cases where there weren't a lot of signs that that's what was happening, and then one day he didn't come home. And eventually they found his body. It was a very tragic circumstance. But the pastor, in doing the funeral service, kind of named it openly. What happened, and how, he should have sought help, and that there was an element of he should have sought help. There was an element of, people are good at hiding it, and so don't beat yourself up forever that you somehow missed it. And that also talking about that there's nothing that can separate you from the love of God. And that even when we miss it, God doesn't. And so use the passage from Romans 8 that is, probably my favorite Bible verse. And certainly one that has gotten me through my darker moments was exactly that verse. That nothing can separate us from the love of God. No matter how bad a person I feel that I am at any given moment, God still loves me. And I, definitely take that from that Romans passage. And talking about how, from her theological perspective, and I agree with it, that within God's grace there is forgiveness, and within God's grace there is room even for those who take their own life. Because some of it for me is it is a function of mental illness, and that the brain is an organ, and an organ can get sick, just like any other organ. And the treatment for a brain sickness is often therapy, and that helps your brain's chemistry level itself out by working through these things. That there are treatments for this. But in the end, that, at least from my theological perspective, there is forgiveness, and there is a place in heaven even for those who take their own life.
Yeah.
If there's
it's actually kind of interesting, because even though I grew up in what would be considered a very, very conservative denomination, that was always their stance on it too. So it shocks me when I hear people in the Church Universal say things like suicide is against the
I certainly
because people do not wake up at that point because they've just had a bad day. Like, there is so much
Well, I mean, you have
behind that.
to overcome a really basic human instinct, and it takes a lot to overcome a really basic
That's
human
exactly
instinct to
what I was
keep
going to
living.
say.
Like,
Yeah.
you have like a genetically programmed gut response. It's the fight or flight thing, right? It takes a heck of a lot of emotional and emotional and brain imbalance to overcome that basic human instinct to keep on moving. Right? I mean, one of the remarkable things about the human spirit is that we are really good at keeping on moving. And so it takes a lot. It is not like I'm just going to go do this tomorrow. Like, whatever. Like, there's a lot that goes into it. It's not just like a whim, like, I'm tired of this. Like, it's not.
Right.
And often, like, you'll listen to, and I end up in these situations. People tell me about these things. I have a target on my back. It's a beautiful thing, actually. But you hear the planning and the thinking and the premeditation that goes into it, and just, trying to minimize, the strange psychology of trying to minimize the effects on other people in how you do it. And there's a lot, like, this is not generally speaking, it's not a spur of the moment thing.
No.
And those theologies, I think, also can be really damaging to the people who are left behind.
Oh,
Yes,
yes.
very much so.
Yes.
Because, it's just, it turns into blaming the victim. In a way where the victim has no voice. And,
so bad.
Right.
One of the reasons why I try to be as open with my story as I can be, I'm talking about it here on the internet to all our thousands of listeners, or potentially, years down the road, right, is to name it and to say that there's another way to look at this, partly for those who are going through it and partly for those who are left behind.
Absolutely.
Because, and that's why I like what the pastor that my mom went to the funeral with said, because she named it. And she talked about it, and she didn't brush it under the rug, and she didn't make it all okay, but she also said that there's God for the person who took his own life, and there's something to that. And there's, this is a subject that we can go on and on about, but I did want us to transition very quickly. We had an email come in to sinboldly@endfear.org.
Whoa!
Yeah, we had an email, so we're gonna.
From someone
No, I'm
you
just
know?
amazed you've checked the email.
I checked the email. I don't do it often, but I caught it. I caught this a week late, but I caught it. So it's that I happen to know that the writer is male, but he wishes to be kept anonymous.
So the writer is a female.
Yeah, okay. So it says, "Hey, Sin Boldly crew. I was listening to episode 37 where you were talking about high vitality churches and their God boxes, and it made me think of my church's interesting issue with cash flow. My church is one of the largest Methodist churches in the area and has beautiful English Gothic architecture that makes it very much a landmark building in the community. However, the church had to dip into the funds for the foundation that gives us our annual operating budget to pay for a landscaping, quote-unquote, beautification project at the church that cost in excess of $1 million because the capital campaign for it did not cover the cost. It leaves me with the question, how much good could we have done in our community if we had spent that money on social justice or outreach programs instead of our quote-unquote God box? One of the biggest struggles of large, wealthy churches seems to be keeping God in the building and not just having a large, pretty social club. Just my 2 cents. Love the show." Hey, Kathleen, have you ever run into something like that?
It's okay, you're not there anymore.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I think we've all worked for God boxes at some point, right?
Yeah, it's such a tough. Because I think there's a point in which the rationale is, and there are some times when it makes a lot of sense, that the level of hospitality,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
Like particularly for landmark churches, that the rationale is that I do understand that improving spaces can create a more welcoming atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, I just spent a fair amount of money at my church redoing our contemporary worship space. right? In that we did not have one, and I made one. And I spent a lot of money for us, but a lot of money for us is like $600. And because there is an element of we need the, and we have a lot of fights in our church, and a lot of the fights in our church have very little to do with like outreach and mission. A lot of them have to do with who's going to clean the church and when are we going to get this fixed? And we need to put cages on the air conditioners so that people in trucks don't keep driving off with them. And a lot of it is that kind of God boxy stuff. And there needs to be some form of balance, right? You gotta keep the lights on, and you gotta make it still a space where people want to be.
I do have to wonder, and I'm going to get in so much trouble because I don't know the particulars of this. So everyone in Radioland, please take this with a grain of salt. Is if the capital campaign doesn't raise the money, is that a priority for the church?
Right.
That's kind of an open-ended question. And seriously, like not knowing the particulars and having approximately zero experience with this, but that's something I do wonder a little bit.
And it gets to the sums involved, right? We're talking like $1 million on landscaping. $1 million. Like, I understand, like, the grass has got to be mowed, right, and it's got to look presentable, right? Within,
it should not look like there should be, cars up on cinder blocks in the front yard, like, and a toilet.
That was all my house.
I was going to make that comment about
Yeah,
it.
and my house, my parsonage, it's kind of like that. But there needs to be some element of make the place look nice.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's got to be a balance there, and that balance I don't think is $1 million in landscaping. But maybe I'm wrong. What do I know?
I have to wonder if it's like when if you ever go to like renovate your house and stuff kind of spiral, and you or weddings. I feel like
weddings
right?
are a good example.
So,
don't ask me how much my wedding
and
costs.
You're like, well, it's this thing that I have to do, and we're only going to do this once, and so. We should do a really good job at this, and all of a sudden,
you spent $40,000 on a wedding.
I'm going to spend $5,000 on a regular dress. If you were like, I'm going to go out for my birthday, and I'm going to wear this dress once, and I'm going to spend $5,000 on it, everyone would be like, you're an insane person.
You're an insane person.
Yeah. So I think that I have to wonder if that creeps in a little bit in churches too. And the scale of the projects are large. Yeah. It's specialized work. So there's all of that too. I have no answers for this. I really don't.
I know. But it's, I'm sorry, plants die. This is going to sound really good. Plants die, right?
It's true.
I understand, investing money in buildings, if you need an activity center or, an outreach building or whatever. We all have dumb names. The Harvest Center. There are dumb names for church buildings. Yeah, that's it. Woodlands United Methodist. They were trying to fundraise $6 million for the Harvest facility. Harvest is named one of their contemporary worship services, but I just kept going don't take my organs.
I was just thinking that.
Just my spleen hurts when I hear Harvest facility. Right? It just
Anyway.
But I understand certain amount investing in ways that church can reach people.
The space doesn't work well for the needs of the congregation. I think that's another.
But they're balance, all things, all things in balance. So again, as ever, this is a discussion show. We're not going to solve any of this, but we should probably get out of here. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any feedback, we read it on air. We really look. We just did that. We just read it. This is my phone. I read it off of my phone. Email. But we took the email. I checked the email and we took the email. So feedback.
That means you figured out the password.
Figured out the password, which doesn't always happen. SYNboldly@nfear.org. If you want me to make sure I really do see it, post it to Facebook.com/the Sign Your Name Project, or at SYNboldly on Twitter. And with that, go in peace to love and serve the Lord and end fear by signing your name. Good night. This is about on Sprockets Forever Downs.
Steven's trying to get the cat to come dance, and the cat's giving him a look.
I figure after such a heavy show, we need just some light dancing.
Hey, a SYNboldly Cat North needs to make an appearance.
SYNboldly Cat North.
Well, with y'all not here, he doesn't just... SYNboldly Cat South doesn't seem as interested in just me.
Oh, it's because he likes the cat ladies.
I'm not a lady.
You can be a lady if you want to be. Gender